أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. In our last episode, we spoke about the Prophet's concerns relating to the Roman Empire. And we mentioned that among the things that happened after his return from his farewell pilgrimage is that he summoned Usama ibn Zayd. He appointed him as the military commander, and he commanded all of the companions, the Muhajirin as well as the Ansar, to join the army of Usama ibn Zayd. Usama ibn Zayd was quite young. Narrations place his age at either 18 or 19, and therefore there was a lot of discontent among many of the sahaba, especially the senior companions, because they felt that Usama was too young, and they felt that a position like that should have been given to a more seasoned and experienced companion. So this discontent began to simmer among the Sahaba. Now eventually news reaches the Prophet ﷺ that many of the companions are unhappy with the appointment of Usama, and there is a reluctance and in some cases a refusal to join his army. So the Prophet ﷺ, when news of their objections reached him, despite his illness, because shortly after his return from Hajj, the Prophet ﷺ became very ill. Now, despite his illness, he mustered up the strength to go to the masjid and to address the Muslims directly. The narrations mention that he emerged from his home draped in a cloak. His head was wrapped with a bandage, and he ascended the minbar. And as usual, the Prophet ﷺ, he begins his speech with the praise of Allah. He extols him, and then he addresses the congregation. He addresses his companions. He says, "Ya ayyuhan nas, فما مقالة بلغتني عن بعضكم في تأمير أسامة بن زيد." He says, "O people, what is this statement that has reached me from some of you regarding my appointment of Usama ibn Zayd as a leader? وَاللَّهِ لَإِن طَعَنْتُمْ فِي إِمَارَتِهِ لَقَدْ طَعَنْتُمْ فِي إِمَارَةِ أَبِيهِ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ." The Prophet, he says, by God, if you are criticizing his leadership, meaning the leadership of Usama, you had already criticized his father's leadership before him. So here the Prophet indicates that your objections regarding his age are similar to the same issues that you had with his father, Zayd ibn Haritha. And then the Prophet, he says, وَأَيْمُ اللَّهِ إِنْ كَانَ لِلْإِمَارَةِ لَخَلِيقًا وَإِنَّ ابْنَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ لَخَلِيقٌ لِلْإِمَارَةِ. The Prophet says, by God, he was indeed worthy of leadership, Zayd ibn Haritha, and his son after him is also worthy of it. فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِهِ خَيْرًا فَإِنَّهُ مِنْ خِيَارِكُمْ. So the Prophet says to the Muslims, so treat him well. Treat Usama ibn Zayd well, for he is among the best of you, right? Despite his young age, yes, he doesn't have the seniority of other companions, but the Prophet ﷺ, he vouches for him. He says, I trust him the same way that I trusted his father. So, after being reprimanded by the Prophet ﷺ, the companions, many of them, unfortunately, begrudgingly, they went to the camp where Usama was organizing the troops, an area known as Jurf. So Usama settles there with the Sahaba. Now Usama, after a short while, he returned to Medina because the camp of Jurf was on the outskirts of Medina. He went back to Medina to visit the Prophet ﷺ. He was concerned about his condition. And when he saw the Prophet's deteriorating condition, Usama begins to weep. Rasulullah ﷺ was heavily afflicted by his illness. His uncle Abbas was present, his wives were around him, and the Prophet reached a point that he was unable to speak. The narrations mention that Usama, he leaned in over and he kissed the Prophet. And the Prophet ﷺ, he raised his hands to the sky as though he was praying for Usama. And it definitely is possible that he was praying for him. And then Usama, after visiting the Prophet, he returned to the camp with his troops. And later he went back to visit the Prophet again. And the second time he goes back, he finds that Rasulullah ﷺ is more alert, he's comfortable, he has regained conscience. And at this point, Usama, he bids Rasulullah farewell. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says to him, go forth with the blessing of Allah. Sheikh al-Mufid, in his famous book, Kitabul Irshad, he notes that at that time, at the time of the Prophet's illness, at the beginning of his illness, Rasulullah was in the house of Salama. And he stayed with Salama for a day or two. And then Aisha, and this is what Sheikh al-Mufid mentions, then Aisha came to her, she came to Salama, and she requested to have the Prophet move to her house so that she could take care of him. So she sought permission from the other wives and they agreed. So the Prophet ﷺ, he was moved to the house of Aisha. And of course, in the house of Aisha, his illness continued for several days and his health worsened. Now during this time, even though the Prophet was sick, he was still able to go to the masjid to offer prayers, especially at the beginning of his illness. He made an effort to lead salah. Now when he goes to the masjid to lead prayer, he returned to his residence and he summoned a group of the sahaba who were present in the masjid, who were there and they shouldn't have been there because the Prophet had ordered the muhajirin and the ansar to depart, to join the army of Usama. So Rasulullah, when he goes to the masjid, he sees that there are still some sahaba who haven't joined. And among them was Abu Bakr and Umar. So he summons them and he says to them, Alam amur an tunfidhu jaysh Usama? فَلِمَ تَأَخَّرْتُمْ عَنْ أَمْرِي. The Prophet, he says to them, I see you in the masjid, you're praying with me. Did I not command you to join the army of Usama? So why have you delayed in following my order? Sheikh al-Mufid, he mentions the following reply from both Abu Bakr and Umar. فقال أبو بكر إنني كنت خرجت ثم عدت لأحدث أو أجدد بك عهدا. Abu Bakr, he said, I had gone. I did join the army of Usama, but I returned to renew my allegiance to you. This is the answer that he gave. A strange answer. The Prophet is saying, go join the army of Usama. He returns and says, I want to renew my bay'ah to you, right? My allegiance to you. وقال عمر يا رسول الله لم أخرج لأنني لم أحب أن أسأل عنك الركب. Umar, he says, Ya Rasulullah, I did not leave because I did not want to have to ask travelers about you. If I went with the army of Usama, the only way for me to know about your condition is that I would have to ask others. The answer to both of these justifications is, with the case of Abu Bakr, the best way to show your allegiance to the Prophet is to obey the Prophet. Not to come back and say, I want to pay allegiance to you, or I want to renew my allegiance to you. And with the case of Umar ibn al-Khattab, if the Prophet is commanding you to join the army of Usama, for you to say that, I don't want to ask travelers about, the Prophet's health, I want to see for myself. So the Prophet, his response to Abu Bakr and Umar shows that he was not satisfied with, and he was not pleased with those answers. فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وآله فأنفذوا جيش أسامة فأنفذوا جيش أسامة فأنفذوا جيش أسامة. The Prophet, he said to them, depart with Usama's army. Depart with Usama's army. Depart with Usama's army. He repeated it 3 times. The Prophet did not sympathize with their answers. He did not say to Abu Bakr that I appreciate your devotion, I appreciate your love. Nor did he say to Umar, I appreciate your care for me. He said to them, depart with the army of Usama ibn Zayd. Now some Sunni scholars, they endeavored to explain this delay through various interpretations. But if you look at the excuses that are given, none of them are really able to present a compelling excuse or a convincing justification for those who refrained from joining Usama's army. There's some narrations that say that, the Prophet, that Abu Bakr had asked the Prophet to be excused because he wanted to spend some time with his wife. Other ulama say that, the Prophet did not command Abu Bakr to leave. But if you look at the narrations, it is very clear that all of the sahaba were asked to join the army of Usama, and you have Sunni ulama like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani who explicitly says that Abu Bakr was indeed one of them. Now, continuing with the passages found in Kitab al-Irshad, Sheikh al-Mufid also mentions that during this period of the Prophet's illness, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he turned to Amir al-Mu'mineen. He turned to Ali. And he said to him, إن جبرائيل كان يعرض علي القرآن كل سنة مرة. The Prophet says to Ali, "O Ali, Jibreel used to review the Quran with me once a year. وقد عرضه علي العام مرتين ولا أراه إلا لحضور أجلي." But this year, O Ali, this year, he has reviewed it with me twice. And I perceive this, I read this as a sign of my death, as a sign of my approaching end. يا علي إني خيرت بين خزائن الدنيا والخلود فيها أو الجنة فاخترت لقاء ربي والجنة. O Ali, I was given a choice between the treasures of this world and living here forever or paradise. And I chose to meet my Lord and paradise. It seems that the Prophet was given an option, whether he wanted to die or he wanted to remain. Whether living forever means, in a literal sense that he's saved from the experience of death, or it means that he will live for such a long time that it's as if, we can say that he lived forever. In any case, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells Ali that I chose to meet my Lord. I chose paradise. I chose to be in the company of the greatest companion, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when Rasulullah's illness intensified and he started to feel its effects, he said to those around him, إني قد أمرت بالاستغفار لأهل البقيع. The Prophet says, I have been commanded to seek forgiveness for the people of Baqi', which is the oldest cemetery in Islam, which is adjacent to the masjid of the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives the Prophet this command. And this shows you the value of the Prophet's istighfar and the nobility of the people who are buried in Jannatul Baqi'. That Allah doesn't want His messenger to pass away without Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam one last time asking Allah to shower His mercy and His forgiveness upon those who are buried in Jannatul Baqi'. So the Prophet, he takes the hand of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Ali, he escorts him to Jannatul Baqi'. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you can only imagine, this scene where Ali and the Prophet are walking together. The Prophet is leaning on Ali. Ali is holding his hand, and he stands in front of that cemetery, a cemetery that holds the bodies of many of his companions, many of his family members. And the Prophet ﷺ, he stood there and he began to address the dead. He starts to address the souls of the departed. Assalamu alaykum ya ahl al-qubur. Peace be upon you, O inhabitants of the graves. لِيَهْنِئُكُمْ مَا أَصْبَحْتُمْ فِيهِ مِمَّا فِيهِ النَّاسِ. How blessed are you? You are blessed in what you have found yourselves in, away from the trials that people now face. أَقْبَلَتِ الْفِتَنِ. Trials have come. كَقِطَعِ اللَّيْلِ الْمُظْلِمِ يَتْبَعُ أَوَّلُهَا آخِرَهَا. The Prophet says, trials have come like the pieces of a dark night, with each following after the other. The Prophet is speaking the language of prophecy. He's saying that there are many fitan that are going to come. The trials and the tribulations are arriving, and you people, O you who have passed away, you're blessed because you're not going to face these difficulties. You're not going to face these trials. So the Prophet, in these words, he's foreshadowing the dark days that await the Muslim Ummah. Bilal ibn Rabah al-Habashi, the famous mu'adhin of the Prophet, he called the adhan. And he was the mu'adhin of the Prophet. At the time of Fajr, he called the adhan. And he went to the Prophet. And he saw that the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet could barely sit. When the Prophet heard the adhan, the Prophet called out, As-salatu yarhamkumullah. Prayer time. May Allah have mercy upon you. He wanted to encourage the Muslims not to take the prayers lightly, not to abandon the prayer, not to belittle the prayer, even if the Prophet is not present. the prayer needs to be performed. فأذن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله بندائه فقال يصلي بالناس بعضهم فإنني مشغول بنفسي. The Prophet says, let someone lead people in prayer as I am occupied with myself. I'm sick. So appoint someone from among you to lead the salah. Sheikh al-Mufid, he says at that moment, Aisha made a suggestion. The Prophet is not able to lead salah, so who does Aisha suggest? فَقَالَتْ عَائِشَةُ مُرُوا أَبَا بَكْرٍ. She says, ask Abu Bakr to lead, her father. Instruct Abu Bakr to lead. وَقَالَتْ حَفْصَةُ مُرُوا عُمَرٍ. Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, she says, no. Instruct Umar to lead the salah. The Prophet ﷺ, he had commanded both of them to join the army of Usama. But when he hears his two wives pushing for their fathers to lead salah, Rasulullah realizes that Abu Bakr and Umar are still in Medina. They should be with Usama, but they're still in Medina, they haven't left. So when the Prophet heard from Aisha and Hafsa, he realized that their fathers stayed behind despite his explicit command. And Rasulullah also noticed how each of these women, they were eager to promote their own father. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he turns to them. He turns to Aisha and Hafsa, and he says, "Ukfufn, stop. فَإِنَّ كُنَّ صُوَيْحِبَاتُ Yusuf. Stop. Enough talking. For you are like the female companions of Yusuf." Inshallah, we'll speak a little bit more about what this means a little later in this episode. So, when the Prophet sees that Aisha wants Abu Bakr to lead, Hafsa wants Umar to lead, he realizes what's happening. So he summons Ali ibn Abi Talib and Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas, his other cousin. Rasulullah, he performs wudu. And the Prophet was so ill that he was leaning on them and his feet were dragging. So Ali and Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas, they're basically carrying the Prophet. The Prophet is not able to walk on his own. When he left his house and he reached the masjid, and of course the Prophet's house was connected to the masjid, so it wasn't a very long walk, the Prophet found that Abu Bakr was in his mihrab. Imagine. Rasulullah had commanded Abu Bakr to join the army of Usama. And then lo and behold, Abu Bakr is standing in the mihrab of the Prophet. So the Prophet, he approached him and motioned with his hand for him to step back. Even though he was in the middle of the prayer, he motions him to step back. So Abu Bakr, he stepped back. And Rasulullah, he stood in his place. And the Prophet did not continue from where Abu Bakr had started. Rasulullah begins the prayer, he begins the prayer anew. Right? He starts the prayer over. And he recites Takbiratul Ihram. Right? So this is what we find in Kitabul Irshad by Sheikh al-Mufid. If you look at the version of the story in Sahih al-Bukhari, you find the following. And it's in Kitabul Adhan, the book on the Adhan in Sahih al-Bukhari. The narration in Bukhari is from Aisha. أنها قالت إن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله في مرضه إن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله قال في مرضه مروا أبا بكر يصلي بالناس. In Sahih al-Bukhari, according to Aisha, the Prophet said, during his illness, instruct Abu Bakr to lead the people in prayer. So this is a big difference. The Shi'i narrative states that Aisha suggested her father. In Bukhari, Aisha claims that the Prophet commanded Abu Bakr to lead the Muslims in prayer. And then what does Aisha say in Bukhari, in the narration? قالت عائشة قلت إن أبا بكر إذا قام في مقامك لم يسمع الناس من البكاء فمر عمر فليصلي للناس. So according to this narration, when the Prophet instructed Abu Bakr to lead the people in prayer, Aisha, she said, if Abu Bakr stands in your place, Ya Rasulullah, the people will not be able to hear him due to his weeping. Right? Because my father, when he stands for prayer, he weeps out of the fear of God, or he weeps because he's thinking about your condition. He's a very soft-hearted person. Right? So here, this narration shows or is trying to portray Aisha not as someone who is trying to promote her father. She praises her father, but what does she do? She says, no, my father, he cries in his prayer. So instruct Umar to lead the people in prayer. So Aisha then says to Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, قولي له إن أبا بكر إذا قام في مقامك لم يسمع الناس من البكاء فمر عمر فليصلي للناس. So Aisha then tells Hafsa, tell the Prophet that if Abu Bakr stands in your place, the people will not be able to hear him due to his weeping. So instruct Umar to lead the prayer. So Hafsa, she tells the Prophet, have Abu Bakr have Umar lead the prayer, not Abu Bakr. So when he sees Aisha and Hafsa both encouraging him to appoint Umar instead of Abu Bakr, the Prophet says, "Ma, inna kunna la antunna sawahibu Yusuf." The Prophet says to them, enough. Stop talking. You are indeed like the female companions of Yusuf. Muru Aba Bakrin falyusalli linnas. Command Abu Bakr to lead the people in prayer. And this is where this is where Hafsa turns to Aisha and says, she says, "Ma kuntu liusiba minki khayra." I would not have gained any benefit from you, meaning that you're always getting me, in trouble with the Prophet. So it's interesting that here the claim that's being made by Aisha is that the Prophet commanded Abu Bakr to lead. And she does not come off as someone who's promoting her father or someone who's looking after her self-interest. She's depicted as someone who is objective, and even though it's her father, she says, my father, he cries when he prays, and therefore it's better to have Umar lead. But a common denominator between the Shi'i narrative and the Sunni narrative is the Prophet was displeased with their bickering, and he referred to Hafsa and Aisha as being similar to the female companions of Yusuf. In the same section of Sahih al-Bukhari, Aisha also reports, فَلَمَّا دَخَلَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ وَجَدَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ فِي نَفْسِهِ خِفَّةً. Aisha, she says that when Abu Bakr began the prayer, the Prophet, he felt some relief. فَقَامَ يُهَادَى بَيْنَ رَجُلَيْنِ. So he rose and he was supported by two men. Now it's very interesting that she doesn't mention the identities of these two men. And we know from Kitab al-Irshad and other narrations that the two men were Ali and Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas. And this again shows you that, and this is not the first time where Aisha refuses to acknowledge or name Ali ibn Abi Talib. Right? There's a sort of erasure of any of the any participation from Ali ibn Abi Talib. And we know that Aisha and Ali ibn Abi Talib were not on good terms during the life of the Prophet and definitely after the life of the Prophet. فقام يهادي بين رجلين ورجلاه يخطان في الأرض حتى دخل المسجد. Right. So the two men, Ali and Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas, they carry the Prophet. The Prophet's feet are dragging on the ground due to his weakness. فلما سمع أبو بكر حسه ذهب أبو بكر يتأخر. When Abu Bakr heard the presence of the Prophet, he began to step back. Right. فأومأ إليه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فجاء رسول الله حتى جلس عن يسار أبي بكر. So Aisha says that the Prophet signaled to Abu Bakr that stay in your place. And the Prophet then came and sat besides Abu Bakr. He sat to the left of Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr continued to lead the prayer while standing. And Rasulullah prayed while seated. And Abu Bakr, Aisha says, Abu Bakr followed the prayer of the Prophet, and the people followed the prayer of Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr was following the Prophet in his salah, right? But the people were following Abu Bakr. So it's almost like you have two imams of Jama'ah. You have one imam, the Prophet, and Abu Bakr is following him. But then the people are following Abu Bakr. Now I want to point out an important discrepancy that we have. In Sunan al-Nasa'i, which is one of the 6 important hadith collections in Sunni Islam, there's another narration from Aisha where she says, أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله أمر أبا بكر أن يصلي بالناس, that the Prophet commanded Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. قالت وكان النبي صلى الله عليه وآله بين يدي أبي بكر فصلى قاعدا وأبو بكر يصلي بالناس والناس خلف أبي بكر. In this hadith it says that the Prophet, when he arrived, he was in front of Abu Bakr and prayed while seated, while Abu Bakr led the people in prayer and the people prayed behind Abu Bakr. So in this hadith, the Prophet did not sit beside, he did not sit to the left side of Abu Bakr. He was in front of Abu Bakr leading the prayer. So the issues with the Sunni narrative are multifaceted, right? So firstly, it does not address the contradiction in how the Prophet could command Abu Bakr to join Usama's army while simultaneously instructing him to lead the prayer, as both of these tasks would require Abu Bakr to be in different places. Right? It is agreed upon that Abu Bakr was commanded to join the army of Usama. So if he was commanded to join the army of Usama, how does it make sense that the Prophet would command him to lead the prayer? He wasn't supposed to be in Medina. This is number one. And this is a problem that no one can explain or reconcile. Either they say, oh well, Abu Bakr wasn't commanded, but that's not true. Or they say, they have to admit that he didn't obey the Prophet. And the narrations that state that the Prophet commanded him to pray are fabrications by Aisha. Secondly, there are inconsistencies in the accounts of Abu Bakr leading the prayer. As we mentioned, some reports describe him praying beside the Prophet, right? That the Prophet sat to his left. while other narrations suggest that the Prophet arrived and prayed ahead of him. And this is more in line with the Shi'i narrative, in which the Prophet intervenes and prevents Abu Bakr from leading the salah. And finally, nearly all of the narrations that mention this episode of Abu Bakr leading the prayer, in almost all of these narrations, Rasulullah rebukes Aisha and Hafsa. And he likens them to the female companions of Yusuf. And this, of course, further complicates the Sunni account. Now, there is no doubt that by referring to Aisha and Hafsa as the female companions of Yusuf, there's no doubt that the Prophet is definitely not praising them. These are not words of praise. These are words of rebuke. So when the Prophet referred to Aisha and Hafsa as Suwayhiba to Yusuf, he was making an allusion to a story in the Quran about Prophet Yusuf and the women who tried to mislead and entrap him. Right? If you look at Surah Yusuf, verses 23 to 34, the women in that story, they were trying to manipulate Yusuf. Right? They were looking and they were prioritizing their own interests. Zulaykha wanted to seduce him. The women were trying to pressure him to commit haram. So the phrase implies that like those women, Aisha and Hafsa were engaging in behavior that was somewhat manipulative or self-serving. Zulaykha, she was trying to manipulate Yusuf. She wanted to get out of him what she wanted. So Aisha and Hafsa, they were engaging in behavior that was manipulative, that was self-serving, that prioritized their own interests in a situation where sincerity and obedience to the Prophet's wishes were expected. They were looking after their own interests. Each of them was promoting their father. They were not thinking to themselves, what does the Prophet want? How can we show devotion to the Prophet? So in this particular context, Aisha and Hafsa were suggesting that either Abu Bakr or Umar lead the prayer instead of, Ali or someone else that maybe he wanted to suggest. Despite the Prophet's earlier instructions for them to join Usama's army. Right? So by not joining Usama's army, they were undermining the Prophet's command. So by calling them the companions of Yusuf, the Prophet was subtly criticizing their actions, indicating that they were acting out of personal interest rather than a genuine concern for the community's welfare or loyalty to his wishes. Now, the question that I want to address before we conclude is, why did Ali ibn Abi Talib not lead the people in prayer during the Prophet's illness? If he was, intended to be the Khalifa of the Prophet, if he was intended to be the Imam after the Prophet. So this is a question that arises. Where is Ali in all of this? Because our Sunni brothers and sisters, they use this incident, the story of Abu Bakr leading prayer during the Prophet's illness, they refer to this as an indication of his greatness and an accolade that should be considered, and one of the things that makes him deserving of being the Khalifa of the Prophet. Number one. So we'll answer this by mentioning a few points. Number one, the fact that Abu Bakr led Salah during the Prophet's final illness, if we assume that he was commanded to do so, this does not indicate evidence. This does not serve as evidence that he is the rightful Khalifa of the Prophet. Because Shia sources explain this issue in detail, clarifying that it does not support the claim made by Abu Bakr's followers. Right? So, number one, there is a dispute about whether he was even commanded to lead or not. Because as we've explained, he was commanded to join the army of Usama. So leading the prayer is actually an indictment rather than an accolade. Because he shouldn't have been in Medina to begin with. So this is number one. Number two, in Sunni fiqh, leading salah, being the imam of jama'ah, does not require adala. Right? In Shia fiqh, the imam of jama'ah has to be righteous. He has to be adil. But in Sunni fiqh, it's not a requirement. Even if they're sinful, as long as they're Muslim, you can pray behind them. So leading the prayer does not require specific qualifications such as knowledge, justice, or courage, or divine appointment. And these are qualities that are necessary for the Khalifa, according to the Shia perspective. Sunni sources, on the other hand, they permit prayer behind any person, righteous or otherwise. So if a fasiq can lead prayer according to Sunni fiqh, then this weakens the claim that Abu Bakr's leadership in prayer implies his suitability for leadership. Number three, there is no clear evidence that the Prophet explicitly appointed Abu Bakr to lead the prayer, as we mentioned. Because the Prophet, what we do know is that the Muhajirin and the Ansar, they were commanded to join the army of Usama. In fact, it is recorded that the Prophet replaced Abu Bakr as the prayer leader. Right? So it's not an issue of this is a mutawatir report. No, we have conflicting stories. We have one story that says he led, and when we spoke about the discrepancies even within the Sunni hadith corpus. And then you have the Shia hadith corpus that says that no, he was pushed back, he was replaced, and the Prophet stood in the mihrab. Number four, leading the prayer on one occasion does not serve as sufficient evidence to establish someone's right as a rightful Khalifa. Especially because in the life of the Prophet, there were many companions who were appointed to lead salah. Mus'ab ibn Umair was commanded to lead prayer. Other people, other sahaba were commanded by the Prophet to lead salah. Amir al-Mu'mineen, during his khilafah, he appointed people to lead salah. So this cannot be used as an indication that someone is worthy of the khilafah. A fifth point to mention is that the Prophet had instructed Abu Bakr and other companions to join Usama's army. And in fact, in some narrations, he curses those who fail to comply. So again, to reiterate, the fact that Abu Bakr disobeyed and did not join the army of Usama, this should be a disqualifier. This should disqualify him from being Khalifat Rasulullah if he's disobeying the Prophet. Because what is the role of the Khalifa of the Prophet? Is to uphold the Sunnah of the Prophet, to uphold the teachings of the Prophet. If someone is openly insubordinate, how does this qualify them in any way to be a leader? Number six, Abu Bakr was removed from leadership roles by the Prophet on at least two occasions. Right? When we spoke about the delivery of the verses of Surah Bara'ah, that when these verses were revealed, Abu Bakr was sent, and then Jibreel descends and says, لا يؤديه إلا أنت أو رجل منك. No one can deliver this message of bara'ah except you or someone or a man from you. So this is agreed upon by all Muslims. And based on the narrations that we looked at, there are at least two occasions in which Abu Bakr was removed from a leadership position. He was told to come back and not deliver the verses of Surah Al-Bara'ah to the Quraysh, the Mushrikeen of Mecca, and when he led the Salah during the illness of the Prophet, he was also removed from that position. And this is alluded to and found in both Shia and Sunni sources. Now, why is it that the Prophet didn't appoint and wasn't adamant about Ali leading Salah? We have to understand, brothers and sisters, that even the public pledge to Ali ibn Abi Talib at Ghadir Khum was not enough to ensure that people honored his right to leadership. If Khutbat al-Ghadir did not convince them that Ali is the rightful successor of the Prophet, do you think it's going to make a difference if Ali leads Salah? If they do not accept his appointment in Ghadir, do you think if that explicit declaration was not sufficient to convince them that Ali is the Khalifa, then leading Salah, leading a single prayer is certainly not going to be convincing evidence. It seems that that this was pointless to even pressure Ali to lead. Perhaps the Prophet wanted him by his side during those last days because there's a transferring of knowledge that is taking place. As Ali ibn Abi Talib says, علمني رسول الله ألف باب من العلم يفتح لي من كل باب ألف باب. That the Prophet taught me 1,000 doors of knowledge, and each door opens up 1,000 more doors. So much of this knowledge was divulged to Ali during his last days. So this is one possible reason as to why Ali was not given this role to lead the prayers during the Prophet's illness. But as I mentioned, if Ghadir didn't convince them, Salatul Jama'ah is not going to convince them. Number 8 is that Ibn Taymiyyah has this argument that he often uses where he says that not everyone suited for leadership in specific contexts is necessarily suited for succession after his death. Right? So even Ibn Taymiyyah, he says that just because the Prophet appoints you as a leader in a certain context, it doesn't mean that we can use that as evidence that this person should be the Khalifa. So the same principle would apply. That even if we assume, just for argument's sake, that the Prophet appointed Abu Bakr, this appointment to lead Salah is not an indication that he was the preferred candidate for the Khilafah. And number 9, we can say that the Prophet, he clearly appointed Ali as his successor and supporter. He compares Ali to Harun. Ya Ali, anta minni bimanzilati Harun min Musa, illa annahu la nabiyya ba'di. The Prophet did not need to appoint Ali as the Imam of Jama'ah to make it clear to the Muslims that he is my Khalifa, especially when he made the declaration in Ghadir. The ahadith in praise of Ali ibn Abi Talib are too many to count. On numerous occasions, the Prophet says, "Anta minni bimanzilati Harun min Musa." Right. So this is sufficient evidence. Whereas Abu Bakr, his isolated leadership in prayer, if we accept it, is going to be deemed unconvincing. So thus we can say that Ali's lack of leadership in Salah, him not being appointed as Imam al-Jama'ah, does not negate his rightful position as the Khalifa of the Prophet. Because if we take into consideration the declaration in Ghadir and Hadith al-Manzila and Ayat al-Tathir and all of the ahadith where the Prophet speaks about the lofty position of Ali ibn Abi Talib, this situation, this episode, this story of Abu Bakr leading the prayer or Ali not leading the Jama'ah in no way casts any doubt in his right as the Khalifa of the Prophet. Inshallah, brothers and sisters, in our next episode, we're going to look at another important incident that happened in the final days of the Prophet, which is Raziyatu Yawm al-Khamis, the calamity of Thursday, when the Prophet asked for a pen and paper. Now, chronologically, the incident of the pen and paper happened before Abu Bakr led the prayers. However, because it was connected to the army of Usama, I thought it would be beneficial to connect those two incidents. So as I said, inshallah, in our next episode, we'll speak about Raziyatu Yawm al-Khamis. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, for tuning in. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.